You know, sometimes the smallest conversations can shake up the way you see yourself and the world around you. That's exactly what happened to me. It wasn't some grand event or a life-altering accident. No, it was a talk. Just one simple, unexpected talk. But before I tell you about it, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It started on a Thursday morning that felt heavier than usual. I remember the air smelled like rain, though the sky hadn't yet decided what to do. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the same spreadsheet I'd been fighting with for days. My coffee had gone cold, but I kept sipping it anyway, half out of habit, half out of defiance. That's when he walked in. Evan, my boss's new assistant, 20-something, sharp eyes, an easy smile that didn't quite match the quiet way he carried himself. I'd seen plenty of young people come and go in our office, most of them full of energy, loud laughter, and ambition that seemed to drip off their sleeves. But Evan was different. He was calm, almost careful, as if he was still figuring out how much space he was allowed to take up in the world. He stopped by my desk that morning holding a small stack of folders. "Mr. Dalton said you might need these," he said. His voice was low, a little hesitant, but there was a sincerity in it that made me look up from my computer. "Thanks," I replied, taking the folders. "You're the new assistant, right, Evan?" He nodded, and for a moment, we just stood there in that awkward silence that often hangs between people who haven't yet decided whether they'll get along. Then he smiled, a real one this time, and said, "I've heard a lot about you. Mr. Dalton says you're the one who keeps this place running." I laughed, though it came out sounding tired. If only that came with a pay raise. That made him chuckle, and it was the first time all morning I felt the air in the office lighten. He didn't rush off after that. Instead, he leaned slightly against the edge of my desk, still polite but relaxed enough to show he wasn't just running errands. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" he asked. 17 years, I said. Saying it out loud made me realize how long that really was. Nearly 2 decades of early mornings, office coffee, and pretending deadlines were exciting. Evan's eyes widened slightly. Wow. I can't even imagine being in one place that long." "Well," I said, half smiling, "you might surprise yourself." He nodded, but I could tell he was turning something over in his mind. Then, almost cautiously, he said, "Do you ever wish you'd done something different?" The question hit harder than I expected. Not because it was rude, it wasn't, but because it was honest. People my age don't get asked things like that much. Most assume we've made peace with our choices. But his question stirred something in me that I hadn't wanted to look at for a long time. I thought about the things I used to want when I was his age. Travel, teaching, maybe opening a small bookstore by the coast. But life had its own plans. Jobs, bills, family responsibilities, they all stacked up like stones, and before I knew it, I'd built a wall out of them. "I used to," I said quietly. "But I guess at some point you stop asking that question." Evan didn't look away. "Maybe you shouldn't," he said simply. The conversation ended when my boss called him from his office, but his words stayed with me long after. I tried to go back to my work, but the screen seemed blurry, my thoughts wandering to places I hadn't visited in years. That evening as I drove home, the sunset painted the sky in soft golds and oranges. The road was familiar, every turn muscle memory by now. But something inside me felt unsettled. It wasn't regret, not exactly. More like awakening. I kept thinking about how easily Evan had asked that question. No fear, no hesitation. At his age, I'd been terrified of asking the wrong thing. Maybe that's what youth was really about, not the energy or the optimism, but the freedom to wonder aloud. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for a long while, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. I could still hear his voice. Maybe you shouldn't. It's strange, isn't it? How a few words from someone who barely knows you can shake loose thoughts you've kept buried for years. At night, as I watched the rain finally arrive, tapping softly against my window, I realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes reflection doesn't come from solitude or age or wisdom. Sometimes it comes from a single, unexpected conversation with someone who reminds you that it's never too late to look at your life again. And that was only the beginning. The next morning, the office felt different. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way the light came through the tall windows, softer than usual, or how the hum of conversation seemed to fade into the background. Either way, something had shifted inside me since my talk with Even. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet awareness, like the sound of a clock ticking when the room falls silent. I saw him again by the coffee machine. He was pouring himself a cup, eyes still half focused on his phone. I hesitated for a moment before walking over, my heels clicking softly against the floor. "Morning," I said, reaching for the sugar. He looked up and smiled, that easy, genuine smile of his. "Morning, Miss Keller." "Please," I said, waving a hand, "it's just Rachel." "Rachel," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "Got it." There was a small pause before he added, "I hope I didn't overstep yesterday," with that question. I stirred my coffee slowly. "No," I said, after a moment. "Actually, it's been on my mind since you asked." He nodded, looking relieved. "I didn't mean to pry. I've always been curious about how people end up where they are. It's easy to think we'll have it all figured out someday." "That's the trick," I said, giving him a faint smile. "You never really do. You just get better at pretending." He laughed softly, and for a few moments we just stood there, two very different people sharing the same stillness. I realized then how rarely I talked to anyone at work about anything that wasn't deadlines or projects. Conversations like this, ones that reached below the surface, were a luxury I'd long stopped expecting. Later that afternoon, our boss called me into his office. He wanted me to review a presentation Even had been working on. It was for a client pitch, and apparently Even had taken the initiative to redesign some of the materials. "He's got good instincts," Mr. Dalton said, "but he could use your experience to polish it." When I found Even at his desk, I saw the project spread out in front of him. Colorful, sharp, full of ideas that had an energy mine had long lost. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see me. "Mr. Dalton asked me to take a look," I said. He pulled a chair up for me, and I sat beside him. The faint smell of coffee and printer paper hung in the air. As we reviewed slide after slide, I noticed the way he listened, really listened, every time I offered feedback. No defensiveness, no arrogance, just quiet attention. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same page. It was nothing, just a small, accidental touch, but it sent a quick jolt through me, the kind that reminds you you're still human, still capable of feeling something unexpected. We worked late that night, the rest of the office emptying out until only the two of us remained. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. Evan leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. "You've been doing this a long time," he said. "Do you ever get tired of it?" I looked at the half-finished presentation in front of us. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's comfortable. Safe." He nodded thoughtfully. "Safe's good," he said after a moment, "but sometimes safe can keep you stuck." His words landed heavier than I expected. There it was again, that same quiet honesty he had the first time we spoke. I admired that about him, the way he could say something simple that lingered long after the conversation ended. When we finally packed up, it was past 7. The office lights reflected off the glass doors as we stepped out into the hallway. The building felt larger, emptier at that hour. "Thanks for helping," he said. "I learned a lot." "Me too," I replied before I could stop myself. He smiled, tucking his hands into his pockets. "Well, I guess that makes us even." As I walked to my car, his words replayed in my mind. Me too. I hadn't meant to say it, but it was true. Working with him reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of curiosity, of wanting to see what else I could still do. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the office lights, his quiet confidence, the way he looked at the world like it was still full of possibilities. I realized then that my reflection wasn't about regret anymore. It was about rediscovery, about realizing that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to change course. And though I didn't know it yet, that single thought, the one that began as a whisper, was about to change everything. The following week moved slower than usual, though maybe that was just me noticing things more carefully. It's strange how awareness creeps in quietly, like a light being turned up in a dim room. I began to notice how Evan's laughter carried down the hall, how he always held the door open for people without thinking about it, how he'd ask questions no one else bothered to ask. He made the office, this place I'd long considered stale, feel a little more alive. We didn't talk every day, but when we did, it always felt unplanned, easy. Sometimes it was in passing, other times over quick lunches where we shared small stories about our lives. I learned that he'd grown up in a small town outside Seattle, that he loved hiking but hated crowds, and that he'd taken this job hoping it would lead him somewhere meaningful. "I'm not sure where yet," he admitted once, smiling sheepishly, "but I'll know when I get there." I told him I used to think the same way when I was younger. He listened, chin resting lightly in his hand, and said, "So what made you stop?" That question stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. One afternoon, we were assigned to prepare a short client review together. Nothing big, just a follow-up report, but it meant another few late hours in the office. The autumn sun dipped low as we worked, casting long amber streaks across the floor. Outside, leaves drifted past the windows like slow, lazy confetti. Inside, the quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the silence between our words. Evan was focused, head bent over the table, pencil tapping rhythmically as he reviewed notes. I found myself watching the way he concentrated, steady, thoughtful, unhurried. He looked up suddenly, catching my gaze. "Something wrong?" he asked gently. I smiled, feeling a little foolish. "No, just thinking." "About what?" "About how different things look when you stop rushing through them," I said. "I've been in this office for years, and I don't think I ever noticed how the light changes in the afternoon." He looked toward the windows. "It's a good light," he said softly. "Makes everything feel a little warmer." We fell quiet after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a calm between us, the kind that comes from understanding rather than words. When we finished the report, it was past 6. Everyone else had gone home, and the hallway lights flickered to their dim nighttime mode. Evan leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Do you ever feel like you outgrew the version of yourself people still expect you to be?" His question hit me like a mirror. I'd spent years fitting into the image people had of me, the dependable one, the steady one, the woman who never complained. Somewhere along the way, I'd started living more for their expectations than for my own desires. "I think we all do, eventually," I said. "We just stop noticing when it happens." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the real reason people stay stuck. They don't realize they've changed." Something in his tone felt personal, like he was talking about more than just work. I wanted to ask, but before I could, his phone buzzed. A text, pulling him back to the moment. "I should get going," he said. gathering his things. "Thanks for staying late again." "Any time," I said, standing too. "And Evan, thanks for reminding me to notice things again." He gave me that same quiet smile I'd grown used to. "You'd be surprised how much you start seeing once you do." After he left, I stayed behind for a while, the office now completely still. I walked to the window, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the parking lot. There was something bittersweet about it, the beauty of endings mixed with the promise of change. On my drive home, I rolled the windows down and let the cool evening air rush in. I thought about his words, about noticing, about change, about the strange, unexpected friendship that had begun to mean more to me than I wanted to admit. It wasn't about him, not exactly. It was about what our conversations had stirred in me, the realization that I'd let my life become a series of routines. Safe, predictable, but lifeless. That night, I took out an old journal I hadn't touched in years. The pages smelled faintly of dust and time. I flipped through entries from a younger version of myself, a woman full of plans, ideas, laughter. Somewhere between then and now, she'd gone quiet. I picked up a pen and wrote one simple sentence: "I want to start again." It wasn't a plan or a promise, just a truth I couldn't ignore anymore. And as I sat there in the stillness of my living room, pen in hand, I realized that sometimes reflection isn't about looking backward at all. It's about turning your gaze forward toward whatever might still be waiting. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. It's strange how one small choice can ripple quietly through your life without you realizing it right away. A few weeks had passed since that night I'd written in my old journal, and though nothing on the surface had changed, same job, same routine, same drive to work, everything inside me felt different. Lighter somehow. Awake. I started taking small walks during lunch instead of eating at my desk. I began saying no to unnecessary tasks and yes to the things I'd been quietly craving. A pottery class, a weekend visit to the coast, even calling an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. It felt like stretching after a long sleep. And through all that, there was still even. Our conversations had grown fewer, not out of distance but out of rhythm. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, something calm and mutual, like two people who had already said the important things. Still, every time he stopped by my desk with a report or asked for my opinion, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a kind of gratitude. Maybe he'd been changed too, in his own quiet way. One Friday afternoon, Mr. Dalton called a team meeting. He announced that Evan had been offered a position at the company's West Coast office. It was a big opportunity, and from the proud grin on his face, I could tell he was excited. After the meeting, as everyone congratulated him, I sat quietly at my desk, smiling but feeling that familiar tug in my chest, the kind you get when something good also means goodbye. Later, when most people had gone, Evan came by my desk, leaning on the frame of the doorway. "You heard?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I did," I said. "Congratulations. You deserve it." He smiled but looked uncertain. "Thanks. It feels right, but it's hard to leave." "I know," I said. "Change always is." He hesitated, then walked closer. "You were one of the first people who actually listened to me here. You didn't treat me like the kid with the coffee runs." I laughed softly. "That's because you weren't. You just didn't know it yet." He looked down for a moment, then met my eyes. "You made me think differently about a lot of things." "And you did the same for me," I said quietly. We stood there for a while, the hum of the office lights the only sound between us. There wasn't much else to say. Some connections don't need long goodbyes. They just leave something behind that stays. That evening, I walked him out to the parking lot. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in soft, fading pinks. Evan turned to me before getting into his car. You'll keep noticing the light, right? He said, that familiar half smile returning. I will, I promised. He nodded once, then drove off, his taillights glowing briefly before disappearing down the road. I stood there for a long time, the air cool against my skin, watching the last of the daylight fade. I felt something settle in me, not sadness exactly, but the quiet fullness that comes when you realize a chapter of your life has closed the way it was meant to. The following Monday, the office felt different again. His desk was empty, the chair tucked neatly in. But instead of the dull emptiness I'd expected, I felt a calm sense of gratitude. Evan had reminded me of something I didn't even know I'd forgotten, that growth doesn't stop at any age, and that reflection isn't about regret but rediscovery. He'd given me a gift far more lasting than a friendship or a lesson. He'd given me back a piece of myself. Weeks later, I found myself standing by the same window where we used to talk, coffee cup in hand, watching the afternoon light spill across the floor. The world outside hadn't changed, but I had. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was just existing between weekends and deadlines. I was present, awake. Sometimes I still think about that conversation, the first one, where he'd asked if I ever wished I'd done something different. Back then, I hadn't known how to answer, but now I think I do. I don't wish for a different life. I just wish I'd noticed mine sooner. So, if you're listening right now, maybe sitting somewhere familiar, the same office, the same home, the same routine, pause for a moment. Look around. There's beauty in the ordinary, lessons in the quiet moments, and sometimes the person who helps you see them can come from the most unexpected place. And if this story stays with you, even a little, then maybe that talk I had years ago wasn't just for me after all.